ahead and get started. Good morning, everybody. It is a very cold and chilly day across the state, so thank you for those of you that are on. Maybe some of you are even joining from the warmth of your own home if the roads were slick. This will be recorded, and we will show you where it'll be posted. We'll send a system-wide email later today with the links once those videos have been uploaded, and we'll make sure everybody has a chance to watch that wants to. In a moment, I will share my screen and we'll get started with the presentation, but I wanted to thank Sarah Keatley for sort of being our Zoom host this morning and making those arrangements. And then on the call, we've got Daryl Waldron from the Northwest. Daryl, if you want to wave. And Beth Hinshaw. And I don't see Diane Mack yet. Oh, she wasn't, that's right. I knew that. Sorry, I just didn't want to get started without somebody. Okay, I think we're all here. Let me share my screen. Let me put this on the right screen. There we go. Can everybody see the presentation? Patsy, will you nod because you're the only one I can actually see? Thanks. Good morning. Those of you just hopping on, this was an idea that we came up with following our county fairs series that we did last year. We're trying to pick topics and kind of breathe some new life or catch everybody up to speed, knowing that we have lots of new hires across the state periodically. And this time we decided to focus on 4-H officers training because at some point during the year, you are all working with teams of young people who are learning what it means to be an officer, from president to secretary to historian, and what those roles and responsibilities are. And we know that some of you have been doing this for a really, really long time, and maybe you're just sort of going through the motions now. Some of you are just doing this for the first time, and you're not really sure how to approach it. So hopefully these two webinars will answer some of your questions, show you where the resources are that we have available, and get us thinking about how we approach our officers training in our local units. So with that, this first morning, we're going to talk about why we do officers training, the philosophy about it, the roles and responsibilities of each individual office, how your clubs do their officer installation, and the publications that we have available for each of the offices. In 2 weeks, we'll do this all over again on February 21st, 9:15, same time. And we'll talk about how we actually do some officer trainings, the different ways of presenting the information in an engaging and hands-on manner. How do we empower your team of officers? We'll cover parliamentary procedure and the different parts of the meeting or the time that your club spends together. This will be hyperlinked. So later when you can print this off on a PDF, this will be linked so you can click on it. I will also show you at the end of the presentation today what page specifically this will be located at. Sarah or Beth or Daryl, I can't see the chat box from my view right now. So if somebody has a question, just stop out and interrupt so we can address that when appropriate.
Thank you, Amy. I'll take it from here for a little while. When we were putting this webinar together, the four of us as regional 4-H specialists talked about some of our philosophy. And so to start it off, we kind of know that, as Amy said, some counties have been doing this for many, many years and are old hat at it. And we also know that sometimes when there are personnel changes, that this is one of the things that kind of gets dropped. So we're hoping that if you have discontinued this in your county or district, that this is something that you really do consider, because we think it's a very important thing and can be a cornerstone for one of your local 4-H program. So some of the things that we want to talk about, officer trainings are, we encourage them as an area staff, and we think, and they typically are held in the fall, usually in October or November, because this is when 4-H club officers are elected, and it's a good time to have some sort of training for them, shortly after they've been elected. And we know that they can be presented in a variety of ways, and that's one of the things that we'll cover the next webinar, some of the different formats that you might use. But in general, as we discuss this, we feel that a face-to-face training provides a major advantage over some of the other delivery methods. So we encourage you to consider that, there's a variety of ways of doing it, but we feel the face-to-face interaction between people is worth the extra time and effort to set it up that way. Next slide. Well, some of the things we want to cover as to why they're important. And the one right off the top is that we elect young members, 4-H members, to an office, and we want to give them the skills that they need to be able to do that office successfully. So that encourages us to offer a specific officer training. Some of the other things that we're trying to develop and showcase the importance of officer training is to help officers that have been in previous offices be able to learn new skills about a new office. A big thing also is that an officer team, it builds teamwork and trust in the club, and that can lead and should lead to an effective and successful year. It also helps by having officers that are trained and do their job well. It helps you to have a successful and engaging and exciting 4-H club meeting. Is if the officers don't know their job and are just sort of muddling their way through the year, probably the meetings aren't going to be very exciting and engaging. So this can help that whole process. It also gives the officers a chance to learn from each other at the actual training by asking questions, because as it's set up, and we'll talk again more about that next time, we tend to have all the presidents together, all the vice presidents and successive officers, so they have a chance to interact between themselves and learn from each other. And it's also a way for officers in all the clubs or however you've organized it to get to know other 4-Hers from across that county or district, or perhaps multi-counties put together. Next slide, please. Some of the keys to a successful officer training are preparation. And we have the word here, facilitators, and that would be the trainers. They have to be competent in leadership and specific officer skills. So if you've asked somebody to lead the presidents and they've never been associated with any presidency in any organization, it may be a little bit difficult. So you need to find somebody who has that skill and as well as the enthusiasm and the ability to teach that particular office. As we know, enthusiasm is contagious, and it not only starts with those volunteers and agents who are organizing it and or teaching. We encourage you to take advantage of the parents and volunteers who are in attendance by offering them a separate session based on their needs. And maybe we wanted to state that positively, but we know that we would like for the members to learn on their own, and sometimes they do better when there's not an accompanying parent. And it's also a good way then we can work with the adults, the volunteers and parents, to teach them what they can do to assist their child in that office. And there are many ways to deliver this program or this officer training, but we encourage definitely hands-on activities, visual aids, handouts to make it experiential learning and not just talking at kids. And the last thing on this for the goals is the officers need to understand their roles in the club and how that officer team needs to work together to accomplish the club's council or council's objectives for that year. So it's a great way for this team to bond together and really provide the leadership for the club and excel in those teaching leadership back to the kids. Next slide, please. Well, what the cornerstone of any 4-H club, as well as, let's say democracy in general, are officer elections. So we want elections that are fair and offer an opportunity for all members to have an equal chance to run for office and to be elected. And that is the cornerstone of any 4-H club. And care must be taken to make sure that a process is in place and followed to ensure that club elections are not only inclusive and trustworthy, but also open and transparent. Because it's not good if the perception is that the elections are rigged in a club. So we always want to go way overboard to make sure that those elections are open, transparent, inclusive, and trustworthy, so that there's no taint of something going on. Next slide, please. Kind of a quote, character is like a tree and reputation like its shadow. I got to get to that slide. I can't read it all. I'm sorry. Character is like a tree and reputation like its shadow. The shadow is what we think of. The tree is a real thing, a quote by Abraham Lincoln. So I think this is applicable to this quote for what we're trying to do with elections. Next slide. Some of the things to think about if running for office. Elections are not a popularity contest, and we know we say this, but sometimes they kind of turn into that. So whatever we're doing, we always want to try to make sure that they are not a popularity contest, that hopefully members are getting elected based on skills and desire to be there and their ability to complete that job well. An office requires a lot of time, commitment, and leadership commitment. So we hope that youth are thinking about that before they decide to run for an office. And so with that consideration, thought with family as well as the individual should be given prior to running for office, so that because it is not just a 4-H member commitment, it's also a family commitment to make sure that that member gets to all the things that need to be done for the year to be an officer for that club. Next slide. Well, nominations are an interesting creature, and there are many ways to do it. And we've kind of delineated it to 3 here. And we got 3 ones. Ignore that, we'll get that fixed later. They didn't renumber. Probably one of the most common ways, and it's definitely used in smaller clubs at the time of election, would be nominations from the floor. You know, it's October, September, the club's having the election, they take nominations from the floor and they go through, and we'll talk about how they do that. And another way to do it is nominations by a nominating committee, and this might be used in a larger club. The nominating committee would get together, whether face-to-face or by some media, to talk about who's running, who would be good to run for an office, and they present their slate of officers at the time of the election. And then the last one, which can be done also, is nominations by written application. And obviously that has to be done ahead of time. And again, it may be used by larger clubs. It is done ahead of time. It's completed by the nominee before the time of the election. So there is a real commitment there that you can't just wing it. So, and we'll talk about some of the outcomes for that later on in the next couple of slides as to how that would impact an election. So clubs that use the first or the second one generally allow members to self-nominate or be nominated by other members at the time of the election. Where the last one, it's got to be prior, because you've got to submit a package as to what your qualifications are and so forth, and that you're interested in running for that office. Next slide, please. One of the things that we often have is that you have nominations, but at some point they're going to be closed. And they can be closed by a motion from the floor, but that does require a 2/3 vote. But if there are no further nominations, the president could declare them just closed. So it could be done a couple of ways. There could be, one of the example I use there, the president might ask, are there any more nominations? Are there any more nominations? Are there any more nominations? And nothing comes up. And then the president says, being none, the nominations are closed. And by asking it 3 times, it gives a reasonable amount of time for the membership to consider, to come forth if there are going to be more nominations. But at the same time, the president might say, are there any more nominations? There might be a 5-second, a 10-second pause. There's nothing happening. And the president, again, can just say, nominations are closed, blah, blah, blah. But it can also be a formal vote. Next slide. Okay, some of the things that that come up. would be that we often hear in an open slate where they're adding, where they're doing nominations from the floor, you know, somebody's nominated and somebody seconds it. It does not, nominations do not need to be seconded. But on the flip side, if somebody is nominated, the chair, the president needs to check with that member to make sure that they agree, that they're okay with being nominated for an office. Because if somebody's not willing to fulfill the duties of the office, then they would not be added to that slate. And again, we didn't really find this written in a lot of places. I'm not sure we found it written anywhere, but we think it's a good thing to encourage the nominees to give a short speech on the qualifications and their desire to run for each office. That's not a bad thing to have them get up, because as we know, we try to give kids, 4-H members, as many opportunities as possible to talk in a meeting, and this is another way for them to get up, say something about themselves, and to begin to formulate and put those ideas together on their feet. And again, a motion to close nominations, if used, requires a second, cannot be debated, and requires a 2/3 vote because it deprives members of one of their rights. So again, it can be done either way, and there's really no one best way or one over the other. Next slide. Okay, in the election and voting, this is a cornerstone of a democracy again, and a cornerstone of a good club election. Officers should be elected by written ballot. They should not be conducted by having the members close their eyes, raise their hand, and some adult, you know, counting the votes. That's not what we want to accomplish in a 4-H club or 4-H council, whatever 4-H entity it is. If we're using a nominating committee, the officer slate should include a voting member to write in the name of a new candidate if he or she does not approve of the selected nominee. So if you're doing just the first one where they're nominating from the floor, it tends to be verbal. I mean, it tends not to be, it's verbal. You're getting the list. You pass out, there may only be one. You pass out slips of paper, they vote for the person that they want. So you may have to have a flip chart up front where you're, you know, listing the office and who's running. But if you're doing a formal slate, you need to have that slate printed and then at least one write-in slot in case somebody else wants to add. Next slide. For voting in elections, voting should continue until a majority vote, and a majority vote is 50% of the votes plus one more. So if you have 16 members voting, that's 8 plus 1 to be 9 members, 9 votes to have a majority. So it's a mathematical percentage that you can quickly figure out. So they got to receive a majority vote and by one candidate. And names should not be withdrawn from the list, even though 1 or 2 can obviously be ruled out unless the nominee chooses to withdraw their name. So this could mean that voting may take more than one ballot for each office. And this is something that we probably haven't done well, is sometimes we've eliminated the ones that didn't receive enough votes and you re-vote. So it could, at some point the group will realize, well, we're gonna have to switch because we're in a tie here. Next slide, please. One of the things that can be done is officers may be elected all at one time or one at a time. And you should follow your bylaws. So obviously if the club doesn't have any bylaws that they can find, that's another creature, but we encourage you to go through with that club to create bylaws for that club. That's a good learning experience also. Electing officers all at one time saves time, but it prevents opportunities for members to run for other offices. And this is probably one that we do. For example, I'll take the example of KAE4HA. We have a kind of a slate of officers. We found one person usually to run for each office, sometimes more than one. And we tend to do it quickly and say, somebody says, I move that we cast a unanimous ballot for these people and blah, blah, blah. And they're all elected. And can you hear the train coming? But anyway, we don't recommend that for a 4-H club because this is a big deal and we should make sure it remains a big deal because kids like running for office and they take it seriously. It can be something that they can be, you know, their feelings can be hurt when they're not elected. So by offering the chance to elect them one at a time, it will allow, if they're not selected, they can run for the next office and the next office. So sometimes children run for 6 offices that night. And we hope that they got elected to one, but sometimes they don't, and that's okay, because not every person gets elected who runs for an office, and that's part of a learning process. And we can put it in a positive way to say, you can try again next year, do better in your speech, tell them what your qualifications are, why you're passionate about this office, and we can work with them on that. And the last one, the president announces each office and nominations, with the vote then taken by written ballot. So then, as I've said, those non-elected could be nominated for a later office if the bylaws allow for that. Many bylaws simply don't get that specific. So you just have to look to see what your bylaws say. Next slide. Okay, so we encourage that you start with the highest office, like president, then go to vice, secretary, treasurer, parliamentarian, reporter, historian, song leader, and so on. Because then, as they aren't selected for that office, they could run for the next office. The president probably will appoint a member, an older member, leaders to collect the ballots and ask that if all members have voted before directing the count to be made. And again, one of the things that sometimes new families don't realize, or adults don't realize, is adults never vote in an officer election. It is for members only, and adults aren't members. Even if there's only one nominee for each office and none is added from the floor, a vote is taken separately for each office. And again, that's to encourage that there's separation for each office and keeping it open, transparent, inclusive, and trustworthy, and not just doing this quick, I move that we accept the slate of officers and it's done in 5 minutes. I think for many clubs, this is it's an important process, and it might take 15, 20 minutes to do the elections in September, October, November when they're done. And that's a good thing. It might be the program for that evening. It's important. It's important enough to elevate it to that status. So I think what we don't want is elections that are done in 3 minutes or less, because it means that they were just an afterthought. And this is the framework for that club for that year, and having a good slate of officers is what will make that club really click and reach the goals of that club. So anyway, those are some of the things that we thought about it. There's another slide on election and voting. And the president can vote, and he or she should vote at the same time as the other members, but the president can't vote for a second time to break a tie. So just know that they can't double dip, so to speak. And while it's the duty of every member to vote, he or she can't be compelled to do so unless the bylaws state that everybody has to vote. So if somebody chooses to abstain, that's part of democracy. You may do that on your own, but it's a good process. So I think the next slide, go ahead and flip to, is on questions. So if anybody has any questions that they have about the election process, nominations, and voting, please fire away, and one of us will try to address that question for you. Any questions verbally or by chat? Okay, I think I will let it go on to the next slide, and I will put myself back on mute. Thank you.
So we want to talk a little bit about the role of officers in 4-H clubs, groups, 4-H councils. We know that each officer has responsibilities that are detailed in their specific officer handbook that KSRE makes available, by the club constitution and bylaws, or even by club tradition. So we're going to share a list of some of those responsibilities. It is not an exhaustive list, but it's a list of, when we're looking at, what are the majority of the responsibilities that an officer has. So some of these you'll see on the screens that follow.
Real quickly, before we switch gears completely, I just saw a question in the chat box dealing with some bylaws and voting, people who vote. So I thought maybe we could address that quickly. Deborah, in Wyandotte County, our council bylaws have designated voters, which includes adults. We allow the designated adults to vote on motions during council meetings, do we need to change that to say adults are excluded from all votes or just from voting for officers?
Okay, 4-H councils may be a little bit different of a creature. When I said that adults don't vote, I was referring specifically to 4-H club. And so there are many 4-H councils, or perhaps it doesn't have that name, but that's what it is across the state. I know many 4-H councils have representation by club, and sometimes they have 1 or 2 youth members, 1 or 2 adult members per club. And then I would say, if the bylaws specify that everybody who's a designated or voting, they're a voting member, then adults would be able to vote because those bylaws specifically state in a council that there's representation for each club with so many members. Then you get into, sometimes people want to do a proxy, they can't be there. Again, that should be annotated in the bylaws to allow that. If it's not allowed, you know, we could have more discussion, but probably then proxies don't get to vote unless it says they can vote. Somebody can't be there. So we were talking about 4-H clubs, but 4-H councils or shooting sports councils or horse leaders councils, there are a lot of other combination councils out there that might have designated differences in their bylaws that allow this. Hopefully does that help you there, Deborah?
It does look like from the chat that did answer Deborah's question. Thank you for asking. So when we think about your club presidents, this is the person who's really going to set the tone for your club meetings and, you know, probably the tone for your whole 4-H year with that group. And so that president has responsibilities like talking with the leaders and the other officers ahead of time so that they're preparing ahead of time for the meeting. Telling the leader and the vice president well ahead of time if they're not going to be able to be at a meeting. Our president also, we have the expectation that they're going to conduct the business meeting according to parliamentary procedure and in a considerate and fair manner. And that's really what parliamentary procedure is about, is just making sure that we are fair to all in the group. The president has a lot to do also with encouraging everyone to participate in the meeting. Daryl mentioned earlier about, you know, we really want to give young people an opportunity to talk in their meeting. And so the president can do that by calling on different people to lead discussion, to lead the pledges, to, you know, choosing who he's going to call on or she's going to call on to make the motion, and so on. A couple of other president's responsibilities is, you know, making sure that everybody gets to serve on a committee some point during the year. And we want to encourage presidents to delegate responsibilities so that they don't have to do everything themselves. That also helps the members feel more a part of the club. It's important that the president attend as many 4-H meetings and activities as possible. You know, they're setting the example for everybody else in the club. And we want that person to be prompt and to be enthusiastic. And we know that the president also has a responsibility often to represent their club at other meetings and other events. The vice president certainly needs to kind of be the understudy for the president. They're going to assist the president during the year on any plans or any special work that needs to be done. They are going to preside at the meeting or represent that 4-H club or group at other events when the president has to be absent. They will also work with the leaders and the other officers on committees and other group activities. And probably in Kansas 4-H, the thing that we think about the vice president being most responsible for is the program committee, and to help the club plan meetings and activities and work with those folks who are on the program each month. So as a vice president, we want to make sure that they're checking in with those that are on the program to see that they're ready and that they need help. And then they have that responsibility to introduce the program and then thank the program participants as well. And then also following up with the club secretary to send a thank you for those outside presenters. Now, the club secretary is another job that's full of responsibilities. And you can see the secretary's record book there. Just flipping through that book, you see how many responsibilities we put on a 4-H club secretary. But they're going to discuss items of business with the leaders and the president. They have the official record, and so they have to inform the president of any unfinished business that needs to go back on the agenda for the next month. They sit next to the president during the business meeting to help with things, to help count, to show where something was in the minutes, that kind of thing. They inform the president and the leader if they're going to be absent as well, because again, this is a big responsibility for somebody that's going to have to step in and do that work during that meeting. They work cooperatively with all other officers, and they call the roll and they keep an accurate record of attendance. And this is becoming even more important in those counties or districts where there are some attendance requirements to do things at the state fair, or pardon me, at the local fair. The secretary's record is the official record of attendance.
Beth, there's another question. Want me to read it to you?
Certainly.
The question is, do councils generally have programs during the 4-H council meeting? Ours doesn't yet. The council meetings take from 1 to 1.5 hours. Should we incorporate a program?
I think it makes sense to put a program in if it makes sense to have a program. You know, if the council's going to be involved in some kind of a fundraiser or some kind of a community activity, it may make sense to have somebody come in and do a program at the council about that activity they're going to take part in. But you know, if you're already running up to an hour and a half, you certainly don't want a lot of program.
And there's one more question. I realize that some clubs still take notes by hand, but are there any plans to update these books for the clubs that are using electronics to take notes at the meeting?
That's a really good question. You know, we're always being pushed into the next technology, and we do have a number of clubs where the secretary will just be putting that all in on a tablet or putting it in on a laptop, and that's certainly fine. You know, any of those, and I've also seen club secretaries when I'm looking at club secretaries' books, let's say at a county fair, where they've done their entire role and attendance in an Excel spreadsheet, and that's certainly fine as well. I wouldn't say that we have something on the table right now, but I think we're always looking for, you know, what's the next thing that we need to do. But we certainly encourage the secretary or any of the officers to use whatever tools they have available to do their job in the best way.
You know, I'll add there. I mean, I think it's okay. The secretary book has a slot for that month's minutes or whatever. I think it would be okay to, again, some of the others may disagree, to say see attached. And if they've done them on a computer, they could attach those electronic minutes that they took to inside that book. But that doesn't make it an all electronic book like you may be referring to, Debbie.
I see another question. Oh, Deborah said she'd like an electronic version also. Yeah, and you know, we're always, like I said, we're always, you know, looking at what might be possible, and so we will certainly keep that on our list.
And one more comment on this. We also know that many 4-H clubs meet in buildings that do not have Wi-Fi or connectivity. So whatever we do, we always have to factor in the lowest common denominator for technology, because if you don't have any technology or any Wi-Fi or connectivity, you can do it on a laptop or some sort of device, tablet, but you're gonna have to print them off later. So we just try to figure out, I mean, it's not always possible to have connectivity everywhere.
Okay, and I saw one more question. Any plans to update the officer training publications? I would say that that is not on the top priority list right now, but we certainly know that, you know, as with everything, it needs to be updated from time to time. So a few more secretaries' responsibilities. They read the minutes of the previous meeting and make, you know, any necessary corrections that the group points out. They take accurate notes of the events at each meeting. They're going to assist the president, you know, with writing down exactly what the motion states. And that's another reason why they're sitting right there by the president. So, you know, when we've got something kind of complicated going on, they've got that written right there for the president to read from. And then they've got it correct for their minutes as well. And then they also read correspondence that's directed to the group and write letters or thank you notes for the club.
Debbie, or Beth, you have another question. It says, you said you see secretary books at the fair. Interesting. How are they displayed?
I've judged a lot of officer books at county fairs, and they're either laid out on a table or, you know, whatever kind of display rack or, you know, whatever somebody has for that county fair. But I would say that there are a number of counties that have classes for officers' notebooks, and we also have some scorecards up on the Kansas 4-H website for screening or looking and, you know, awarding ribbons to those. A few more secretary's responsibilities. As I said, that secretary has a lot of responsibilities. They maintain a record of all the officers and committees in the secretary's record book, and they cooperate with that reporter as well, you know, to make sure that the correct information is going into articles for the newspaper. And it doesn't say it here, but they would also coordinate very well with that historian to just make sure that we're saving things in an accurate way as well as the historian. And then they use those notes that they take at each meeting to write up minutes of the meeting that will be shared at the following meeting. So the treasurer responsibilities include, they have a little prep work to do. They have to go to the bank with the club leader to update the signature card. It's important that club treasurers get the training and understand that they don't spend any money without club approval. And a motion to pay a bill should be passed and recorded in the minutes. They write checks for all expenditures, and they don't pay bills with cash. And they do not do business by online or internet banking. The best procedure is that they have a bill, they pay it, and they get a receipt for it. I know that we have a number of units who would like to see online and internet banking as a possibility for 4-H clubs. We are not there yet. It comes up every year, but at this point, that is not something that administration approves us to move forward with. Treasurers also deposit all money in the bank as soon as possible. And then it's really important to help treasurers understand that they have to keep the club money and their own money separate. And, you know, using any club money for yourself, there could be legal consequences of that. There is a treasurer's record book, and they will keep that for their records. They keep all the bills and the receipts and other information in that book. They prepare a budget to guide the club and communicate to the club its financial position. And depending on your club constitution and bylaws, you know, there may be a budget committee that actually does that. A really important piece for the treasurer as well is that 4-H club financial review each year. And so the kinds of things that they pull together for that committee are the club budget, the bank statements, canceled checks and deposit slips, receipts of all income, treasurer's register, or check register, which is their ledger report essentially, and then bills for expenses. And then the treasurer should remind the financial review committee when that financial review report needs to go into the K-State Research and Extension Office. Typically that's by November 1, but we probably have a few counties who maybe have a November 15 or a December 1, but the treasurer needs to know that at the beginning of the year, you know, when are those going to be due so that they can get everything done. Patsy Maddie asks, are club minutes required to be included for the financial review that notes the motions for bills to be paid? They are not required at this time, Patsy. I would say certainly if the financial review committee has any concern about that, you know, that all happens locally at the local club level, so they could certainly ask for those if they feel like there's something that they question or something that is not clear. So the recreation leader, they really bring the fun to our 4-H clubs, and we want them to make recreation an important part of the club meeting and to prepare a variety of games and activities for each meeting and to lead them. And the reason variety is important is we don't want to get in this habit where every month at the 4-H club meeting we play dodgeball, because, you know, we probably have 20% of our group that thinks dodgeball is awesome. And then we have others who they would just prefer not to. So we want a nice variety of games and activities at each meeting so that everybody can take part and be involved. The recreation leader has that opportunity to teach their fellow club members about how to learn from teamwork activities as well. We want them to encourage everyone to participate, and we want to be sure all members have fun. We also want to be sure that all members are safe. The song leader, you can see we have a 4-H songbook that is available. They're going to lead the group in singing at each meeting, and when requested at special events, they teach the club new songs, and, you know, the song leader creates that feeling of friendship and that 4-H spirit at club meetings through the use of music. And they also help club members show their enthusiasm and use their energy for fun and enjoy the group meetings by singing together. We have a number of clubs who, you know, they have maybe one song that they sing at every meeting, and then they have a variety of other songs that they sing. We have clubs that sing happy birthday to the birthday members each month. There's a variety of things that, that they can do that really build that good 4-H club tradition. So the historian is going to keep a record of the club's accomplishments and activities for the whole year. So that's collecting pictures and news clippings about all the club activities and their members. They probably are going to really have to enlist the help of the secretary to make sure they get, you know, everything straight. And then also enlist the members and the parents in the club to help collect pictures and those clippings as well. And then they organize a scrapbook to tell the club story for the year. And the scrapbook should be meaningful and permanent to members and future members. So, we've all seen the old scrapbook with the construction paper, and there's a ribbon that ties it all together on the edge. And certainly that is still fine. We also know that there's a lot of options now for online or, building your scrapbook digitally and then having that printed. And so those are certainly options as well. I've known 4-H clubs that once the historian puts that all together, they print one for the club, but then it's also available if, others in the club want a copy of that too. And you can go online and find those options. I think Snapfish is an option. There was another one that I was going to remember. Shutterfly. And there may be others that people know of as well. But just another option, we talked about with the treasurers and the secretary stuff, we'd like to see some, options that use technology. There's probably some things on the market out there that the historian can already use. So the reporter needs to visit with their local newspapers, their radio, or their television stations to learn about the requirements for submitting news. And then they'll become familiar with the how-to of news writing. And their job is to submit interesting reports and pictures of club activities, members and leaders to the local newspapers, radio, and television stations. They also report the news to the local extension office for the local 4-H newsletter or for the local 4-H website. And it does seem like often our reporter or our historians might also have something to do with the social media accounts that the club has, as far as getting pictures up there and letting people know right now what's going on with the club. So we have a lot of very specific responsibilities for club officers, but what we know is that we need to expect things of our officers, as far as leadership, that are going to strengthen the club meetings, activities, and the educational environment. So when we think about the other things that we want officers to do, we want them to work with the club members and the other officers at the beginning of the 4-H year to set the goals for the club. So really get that officer/leadership team started with goal setting for the year. It's important that the officers, because they are role models, get to know all of the members in the 4-H club. Our expectation is that officers show up early to meetings. They're going to assist with chairs, with unloading, with setup, with whatever needs to be done, because that's part of your role when you're in leadership. Officers should be inviting their friends and acquaintances to join their club. So the club should be just as important to them, and even more so that they want their friends to be involved as well. Our officers have a big role in helping potential members and visitors feel welcome. And that should really be something that they're always thinking about. When new people come to our club, what is it that I can do to help that new young person feel welcome here? And then once people choose to join the club, or even when they're visiting, they're going to welcome the new members to club, and they're going to introduce them to others in the club. And I talk about this at officer training a lot, and a lot of people are like, well, that's the president's job. The president's going to stand up there and say, we have this new member, or we have these visitors. But it's really everybody's job throughout the club meeting, at recreation, at the snack time afterward, to make sure that we're welcoming new people and getting them introduced to others in the club. Officers should feel the responsibility to attend their meetings and their activities regularly. Again, they are a role model in that leadership role. And officers let their fellow officers and club leaders know if they're going to miss a meeting. And then they also follow up with the other officers and club leaders after they miss, so they know what they missed and what still needs to be done, or what further responsibility that they have.
Andrea shared in the chat box for 4-H Pictures, we've created a share site on Shutterfly. The link was sent to 4-H families and they can join and add pictures. It hasn't really caught on yet, but could be nice to be able to share pictures.
Andrea, that's a great idea. And I think, while maybe those things haven't caught on yet, I think as time goes by, I would think that it might. Has anybody else experienced that?
The only thing I would caution there is to make sure that the use of those photos, if they're being shared beyond that, then make sure everybody has that photo release signed. Otherwise, that's a tremendous way of taking advantage of technology.
Yes, and that photo release, your club leaders will know who has signed off on the photo release, as far as pictures on your social media sites, or that your club reporter, club historian, any of those groups are taking. And Amy brings up a great point that is important that we follow that.
And Patsy mentioned that a lot of her clubs have private Facebook groups for, club only type of photo sharing. So great, good examples. I wanted to touch briefly on something that maybe clubs don't always take the time to do, or they do it kind of as an afterthought. But we really want to encourage our community clubs and councils and anybody with an officer's team to really take the time and choose an installation ceremony. It's a bit of pomp and circumstance, but I think it helps set the tone of the importance and the potential for really being something special, for setting the tone, setting the bar high for the year. Like Daryl said earlier, elevating the role of being an officer. It's something special. It's not something to take lightly. It's not something to just, do willy-nilly. So we have lots of different ceremonies, installation ceremonies available. Officers can choose one. You can rotate through them. Don't do the same one year after year, although the one with the candles I vividly remember doing it as a child in my own 4-H club. But I remember it being very special. I watched older kids get to do it, and then I remember when it was finally my turn, and I thought, oh my goodness, I'm finally one of them. And so we've got Kansas Celebrating with Ceremonies publication that I've got featured here. Many other states, if you Google 4-H officer installation, a variety, there's a lot of different ones posted on other sites. I also want to mention, we recently, I think 12 ceremonies that Andrea Feldkamp had put together when she was formerly in Riley County. And we've posted those on our officer training resource page. And again, I'll show you where those are located in a moment. But again, there are some funnier ones. There's some one, if you have a particularly younger officer team, you might find one that's more meaningful to them. The candle one is a little more serious, but find one that your club would find enjoyable. And take the time to do it, I guess, is the other thing. That would be a good program for the night. And again, it just sort of sets that tone of importance.
So next we would just like to show you where on the Kansas 4-H website the officer publications can be found. And so Amy, if you want to go ahead and we'll walk through, start at the Kansas 4-H page and we'll walk through that. I just wanted to add while we're waiting for Amy to get there, if you do have your treasurer's books come to your county fair, make sure that they take off the identification of their account. I've seen books, I've judged books where, you know, there's the bank statements, actual bank statements. And so we do want to have those taken out of the books and left out as they do display those. So here we are at the Kansas 4-H webpage. We're going to click on resources. We're going to go to the 4-H library. And then at the top there, we're going to go to the 4-H clubs link, and then officer resources. So this is where we're going to actually put the links to the webinars and a copy of the PowerPoints that we've been using today. And then as you can see, those are where those books are that Beth was highlighting with the different officers that she was talking about, presidents, treasurers, the song leaders. And then as we add things, she talked about Andrea's listing of the installation ceremonies. That's where we put that. Andrea was very creative in putting some of those together. And so we asked her if we could make a little packet of those. So there's 12 there. Again, there's this wealth of information. Many of you already may know that it's available, but we just wanted to highlight that. The other piece we would like to share is this 4-H Officers Handbook from National 4-H Council. And we have the link within the web. Yeah, so it's a little handbook. Now, you can buy one for each of those officers or at the club level because it is kind of a little workbook. It does have all the responsibilities of the specific office. And then in there too is where they would talk about some committees or how they would put together their agendas for the club. And as you can see that the price there is $636. So you know, maybe your clubs would want to do that, and maybe that would be a little too pricey for them. If you just got one, you could kind of work through it together as a team. So with that, we do appreciate you all attending, and to announce, and then we'll take time for questions here, but that our next one is February 21st. We're going to focus on, you know, those specific ideas for officer training, not only a face-to-face one, but looking at some other opportunities. We're going to look at empowering the officer team, parliamentary procedure, and then looking at specifically the parts of a meeting. So are there any additional questions or suggestions that you've found successful in your own local unit?
I do want to quickly mention and thank Susan Schlichting. A lot of the images in the PowerPoint were taken from Ellis County officer training activities. So I don't know if Susan's on, but thank you, Susan, for putting those and making those available. Other questions on the process of nominating or voting in elections, responsibilities of officers? Okay. One thing we had toyed around with yesterday was kind of making almost like a cheat sheet for the nomination process or the voting process. So what does the president say, and in what order do you go through it? And, you know, maybe you could print it off on cardstock and laminate it and give it to the clubs to keep, and they could, you know, you only do this once a year, and so from year to year you kind of forget. So maybe it would be nice to have sort of a handy reference sheet to walk them through that process. So I think we'll probably pursue that idea and make that available to you. Thanks, Rachel. Other questions while you're on? Okay, well, feel free to share this later today. We'll send an email out, like I mentioned earlier, with the link to where they are recorded and posted. Share this with your coworkers, any of your master volunteers that are helping with officer training, and of course, any of your club leaders.